So hello, I'm Toby. I realize I think I often with these talks I forget to introduce myself, but seeing as we've got Trevor here as well, it's we're always nice to have new people. So I'm Toby. I'm the president of the CathSoc here, as well as a final year music student. And at the same time, I'm quite keen on philosophy and theology as sort of a little side interest of mine to escape from my studies. And so often my talks have this kind of slant on them. And so while it might be quite philosophical at the beginning, I urge you to hold on, as there's hopefully more practical things to be said in the second half and things you can take away. So today we're talking about discerning truth in today's culture. So what we'll be discussing, we'll be talking about what is truth? Does it even exist? If yes, then how do we discern truth in the world today? Do we even want to? And what are the difficulties with doing so? And then finally, sort of to conclude it, tie it all in as to how we can proceed in our lives, how we approach truth, and how we can live out the truth in our lives and help to find more truth. So to start with, of course, we need to know what is truth. And it's actually quite a difficult one to explain because the more you look into it, the more it starts to unravel. But we'll try to keep it simple. And you could say truth is the property of being in accord with fact or reality. So essentially, sort of saying it as it is, it's the idea that what is being said or what is happening is in fact happening. Okay. Some other definitions include that which corresponds to its object, and that which describes an actual state of affairs. So to give us a little biblical reference here, we could think of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. When he talks to Jesus and he asks him if he is true to all of these accusations that have been held against him, claiming that he's the Son of God. And famously, Jesus is silent in response. And so Pontius Pilate sort of reacts almost with a sense of truth in him and actually says before the crowd, I believe this man to be innocent. And you could say in that case, his statement was truthful because, as we know, Jesus was innocent at the time. Well, he is innocent, sorry. And so, yeah, Jesus was innocent. And so you could say that was a true statement. So where do we get into a bit of confusion? Just before we get there, we're going to just go over a few more truths about truth. And I'm sure by the end of this talk, the word truth will start to sound very strange to everyone, but we just have to hang in there. Okay, so truth is discovered, not invented. So to help you think of this, you can think of gravity, which existed prior to Newton. So before Isaac Newton discovered gravity, it was still there. Apples were still falling, everything was still responding according to gravity, but no one had really figured out, why that was happening. And so when Newton came along and discovered this concept of gravity, he didn't create gravity, but merely discovered it. Okay. Truth is transcultural. So if something is true, it is true for all people in all places at all times. Okay. So the example here is 2 + 2 = 4. And this is true for everyone, everywhere, at every time. It's never any different. It's not if you go to Australia, it suddenly equals 5 or something. That's not how it works. Next, we have truth is unchanging, even though our beliefs about truth can change. So this is where a lot of the misconception lies, actually. Because I think often people think that when someone believes something, they're making often a truth claim. And to some degree, there's some that has some legs, but we'll come to see how we should view it in a second. But regardless, we can believe something to be true, but that shouldn't impact how true the thing is. So that follows on to that next point, which is that beliefs cannot change. So no matter how sincerely they are held. So if someone sincerely believes the moon is square, that only makes that person sincerely mistaken. And so that person can then change their belief that perhaps the moon is round, and then their beliefs and truth are in accordance. But the truth of the moon being round, spherical, has never changed. So thus, contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. So, truth, does it exist? This is where, I mean, to some of you might think, of course, truth exists, right? Because often we live with this view. We don't act as if things can't be known. We act as if they do. However, culture and today's world will sometimes have you believe otherwise. Okay, so one thing people can say is that truth is relative, truth is subjective. You know, what's true for you is not true for me. And what goes hand in hand with this is sort of beauty and preference, taste. So here I have the famous expression "apples and oranges," which is often is an English expression to mean these things are incomparable, right? They're just different. You can't compare them, even though people would like to try. And the reason that is not really. Often it's just due to a lack of specificity. So, for example, you say, "Oh, an orange is better than an apple." Well, you're only saying the orange is better because you prefer something about it. Perhaps you prefer how sweet it is, right? So now that is potentially a true statement. You could say an orange is sweeter than an apple. That might be true. But the sort of difficulty comes when we start to now try and use that to determine what is better. So often that's really what preference boils down to is actually more specific things which actually can be compared. Okay, you can say an apple is more red than an orange, and that could be true, unless of course it's a green apple. And then we have things like taste in art and music, for example. And now this is slightly different because now we're to some degree talking about beauty. And beauty, as we hold it, is actually an objective thing. So one example I like to use at this point is the example of a maths problem, okay? So for example, in math, you have these things called proofs, whereby they prove a mathematical truth using certain other mathematical tools, okay? So you can have this one equation, which is often derived from can be hundreds of other equations and that sort of thing. And what I like to think is you have, one proof whereby there are pages and pages of these sorts of workings out. And it all looks a bit like a mess, but regardless, they've got to the end and they've got their mathematical proof and it works. Okay, so you're like, okay, that's fine. And then you get another mathematical proof whereby this person has only used maybe half a page to work out the same thing. It's a lot more elegant. It's a more elegant, sophisticated solution. Now, to me, as a sort of non-mathematician, I'll look at both of them and be like, okay, great. they both work. They sort of both look the same to me. But to a esteemed mathematician, they might look at it and be like, wow, this shorter one, this more sophisticated, elegant one, this one is a beautiful equation, okay, compared to this other one. And so what I hope that highlights is that understanding can often be a key part to understanding the beauty. That mathematical equation could be objectively beautiful. It's just our understanding, which is currently not capable of sort of seeing that beauty. And this can be true for a number of things. This is what you can often explain why some people don't prefer, or they don't think classical music is very good. Now that seems slightly counterintuitive because there are certain pieces which receive, hundreds of thousands of audience members every year, especially a lot of opera composers, Beethoven, for example, a Beethoven symphony. People love them. It's sort of almost undeniable that it's great music, but you might listen to it and be like, oh, it's not too bad. I prefer my Beyonce. And And this might not be because the Beethoven is not beautiful, and that truth is subjective. It might be because currently we do not understand its beauty. So hopefully this will tell you that there are things that can be objectively beautiful. And it's just sort of our job to find out or to develop our understanding enough to recognize them. And lastly, on this one, some people say truth just doesn't exist. And it's at this moment, the only reason I wanted to mention this is because sometimes it surprises me that some people can even think something like this, because the statement in itself doesn't really hold up. If someone is saying truth doesn't exist, well, they're claiming that their statement is true. So you only have to ask the simple question of, is that true? So just sort of completely sort of confound them, I think, which is not what we're trying to do, but I think we're trying to help people understand that truth can be known. Okay. So if truth is something that can be known, we're looking more now towards the ideas of objective truth. Now, typically when we think of objective truths, there are some which you could think of in its purest form, something like a mathematical truth. So like 2 + 2 is 4. That is something which we can't really deny. And that's sort of the closest we can come to. But often, these days, people often hold scientific truths to be often the only thing we can rely on, okay? And then they discount a lot of other proofs, things like subjects like philosophy and psychology, people won't hold in high esteem because it's not got the same scientific rigor, or so they think, than the natural sciences. But if we look there closely for more than a second, we realize that scientific truths aren't really any different from truths we find in normal life. They merely give a sense of reliability due to testing, okay? They hypothesize something, and then they test it, and then they test it over and over again. And if the same outcome occurs multiple times, and they can conclude, then this thing does in fact exist. And so to that degree, they're still not definitive, they're just incredibly likely to occur. They're still just basing their truth on probability. So the same can be true for non-scientific situations. So you can think of how detectives work. They often piece together indirect pieces of evidence and then draw conclusions. So often this is something like a motive and then a means and an opportunity to figure out who's committed the crime, I guess. And so the way you come to a conclusion doesn't have any impact on its truth value. Okay, that's something which is important to hold on to. Yes, okay. There's not 100% way to know if something is true, even in the scientific method. And so the way we actually interact with truth is often belief using probability and trust in our faculties at hand. Okay, so as we saw from the scientific method, the probability. And so let's take a few examples to explain this a bit. If you see a person at the bus stop every day for 2 months at 8:15 a.m., then you could reasonably make a truthful conclusion that this person comes to the bus stop every day at 8:15 a.m. So in this situation, we're trusting on our probability and experience. Okay, we've witnessed this happen day in and day out, and so you can reasonably conclude that it will happen tomorrow. Okay. Another, I think, famous example similar to that is of the sun. We see it go up and down every time, and it should come up the next day, but it's still not 100% that it will. But you can make a reasonable claim that it will. Similarly, if you see a cat sitting on a carpet, you can draw the truthful conclusion that there is a cat on the carpet. And here, this is an example of trusting our faculties. Okay, so here you're trusting your eyes, which to this point haven't failed you to tell you the truth. Okay, and of course I'm wearing glasses, and so they're starting to fail me. But yes, to that point, so we're trusting our faculties. So in conclusion, we have our discernment of truth is the same really as this esteemed scientific method. And this happens through observation, otherwise known as induction. And so long as our equipment, faculties, our eyes are reliable, we can draw reasonable conclusions, otherwise known as deduction. Okay. And I've put, this could explain people's gut feeling. This doesn't really have any scientific evidence, but following this thinking, if your gut feeling hasn't led you astray for however many years you've been alive, then you could have reasonable conclusion to follow it. I would wager that most people's gut feeling may not be as foolproof as, say, like a watch telling the time, but I'll leave that up to the individual. Okay, so I believe anything at all. So if we know there is a truth, why ought we believe the truth? And we could make the point that we ought to find the truth because otherwise we could be in dire consequences. Okay, so for example, eternal damnation. That's the picture I've put on the slide, I think is from hopefully something related to Dante's Inferno. So in that situation, yes, we can believe that if we don't have a good relationship with God and we reject him, then we could be eternally damned. And if that's true, then these are big things. But I reckon that people don't like to live in fear very often, let alone be ruled by it. And so I'd like to suggest a different reason as to why we should seek out truth. And to this, I would like to point our attention to the transcendentals. So if you haven't heard of this term, do not worry. This is something that is held not only in our Catholic faith, but also in the world, in other secular instances. And the transcendentals are the true, the good, and the beautiful. I always think the transcendentals remind me of that Clint Eastwood film, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. But I don't know. But I don't know why they're almost the opposite. But there we are. Okay. And at least in our Catholic faith, we believe that we're made for the true, the good, and the beautiful. Okay, because the true, the good, and the beautiful are God. So God doesn't have truth, he is truth. He doesn't have beauty, he is beauty. And he doesn't have goodness, he is goodness itself. And this is what Thomas Aquinas means by the term divine simplicity. There's no distinction between the parts of God and God himself. His being and his essence, his substance and accidents, his essence is his existence. And of course, that's a massively complicated topic. But suffice to say that we all long for the truth, goodness, and beauty, whether we believe in God or not. And even if you're not sold, let's just think about it for a second. Often, let's start with truth. We desire truth, often even if it's bad. This is what both the judicial system and the journaling sector are often founded upon, finding the truth, no matter what. And with the judicial system sort of bringing about justice based on that truth. We want things that are beautiful. Okay, as I said earlier, people debate whether things are beautiful or not, but if you remember about the math equation, often our understanding limits our ability to see something's inherent beauty. And if you still disagree with me, just think on the things most people find beautiful. Think of beautiful landscape scenery. There's a reason people like to take scenic routes on journeys. When I watch David Attenborough shows, I'm sure everyone's a big fan. And if not, I would encourage you to watch one, something like Blue Planet. They're great because often they combine so many undeniably beautiful things, such as, the interplay of nature and animals. And then think about it further, this is then paired with beautiful filmography by the film team, then paired with a beautiful orchestral music. I think it's for this reason that I've never heard of anyone who says they don't like David Attenborough in his films, but we'll see at the end if anyone disagrees with me. Now, there are various commentaries on what specifically makes things beautiful, but we won't go into those today. However, it is interesting to note that often these things reflect nature. I always find that quite interesting. The more beautiful something is, they typically is more like nature, which I think gives us a hint towards why beauty would be objective. And then lastly, of our three, the good, we want things that are good. When we watch a film or read a book, often we want the characters to perform morally. And when there is an opportunity for the main character to save someone, we want them to be courageous and do it, compared to being cowardly and letting them perish. We want them to be good. On this topic, C.S. Lewis asks us to think of what a different view of goodness would actually mean. So he says, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. He might just as well imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. And so what we can see is that we desire, therefore, what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful in our nature. So now we've spoken about what truth is and why we should want it. Let's now talk about how we go about doing that. Before, however, it's important to be aware of some possibilities. Aristotle believed that we can accustom ourselves to that which is less good, less true, and less beautiful, or even false, bad, and ugly. We want happiness, but sometimes we do things which will lead us to less happiness. What's interesting is that Aristotle believed that humans, we can never do anything that is bad for us intentionally. So even if you think, well, you know, I ate this sort of junk food, that was bad for me, I knew it, but you didn't do it in order to harm yourself. You did it because you were trying to attain a different good, right? So for example, the pleasure of the food, the relief perhaps that you had from eating it. So you're still doing something with the hope for a good, even if that wasn't an actual good. So same for maybe drinking or something. And so though we always seek good, we can sometimes end up habituating these things that are not good, not true, and not beautiful. And the issue with this is that then the things which are truly good, true, and beautiful don't appeal to us in the same way, or the way they ought to. So again, the example with the diet. Let's say, for example, you've been raised on junk food your whole life. You've been raised on crisps or fizzy drinks. So then the chances that fruits and vegetables will appeal to you over these crisps and fizzy drinks is quite unlikely. And that's because what you've done is you've accustomed yourself to things that aren't good for you. And then the things that are good for you, you don't believe them to be goods anymore. And often we can see this with these sorts of examples about food and more tangible things, but the same can be true for the intellectual and the spiritual life. We can accustom ourselves to things which are boring, stupid, dreary, and ugly, so that the things that should move us don't. So that's sort of why we want to follow the good, the true, and the beautiful, and most pertinent of our talk today is the truth. And so we've got to figure out how we do this. Okay. But before I sort of start on this part of the talk, I will need to mention that there's no silver bullet answer here. There's not a sort of straightforward tick by tick sort of approach to every situation in life. In most cases, we'll have to use our judgment to assess whether we can reasonably ascertain if something is true or should be done / believed. However, I can't help to point out a few ways in which we can best do this. And it should be no surprise that the process to find truth comes from our conclusions at the beginning as to how we came to truths, okay? So we make observations, and so long as our faculties are in check, then we can deduce truths, okay? So let's take some more examples to explain this. Okay, so I'm going to use the example of books versus TV. So in this example, I'm going to talk about sort of non-fiction information. So a book about something non-fictional, and I guess the TV equivalent would be some sort of educational show or documentary type sort of show. In this situation, of course, both formats are presenting information, okay, but how can we tell which ones are presenting more truthful information? Well, one indication is sort of the means to get there. So authors have to jump through hoops to get their information published, at least by sort of more prolific publishing brands. And so there's more time spent on the book, and the more time spent on the book, the more likely the publisher will take it on. Often good books as well about non-fictional topics have hundreds of references that you can then later check, okay? And this sort of harks back to its academic origin, whereby, as some of you will know maybe, at university, when you're an academic, you publish a paper, and afterwards it gets peer reviewed by other people, other experts in the field, which sort of check it for approval kind of thing. And this sort of gives us a bit more authority to say, well, this is true, it's been verified by a few other people. Documentaries, however, are not necessarily assessed purely on the information, like a book. You know, documentaries, compared to just the words on the page, they're based on other things such as the filmography, how they're filmed, how they're shown, the music, perhaps, and also probably almost most importantly here is just what the sort of bullet point message is, you know, and often if that's in line with whoever's going to air the documentary. And so you can see already there's less of a focus on the purely the information and that being truthful. And whereas for the books, again, to be successful, they require more articulate expression and verifiable content. Thus, this is an example of how we can rely on the faculty, so much like our eyes and the watch and everything, we're relying on the faculty of books compared to visual media as a type of guide towards truth. Okay, so it's just one example. So you could make a claim that books are generally more trustworthy than TV. And of course, I'm not saying that that's 100%, as we've seen with a lot of these truths. It requires us to be constantly checking and taking into account all of the information. So I mentioned the publishing company. You know, it's sort of like if you read a news article, often, especially in your own countries, you'll know which newspapers have which slanting, and so there are certain things that you have to be aware of. Okay, but again, if we're on books and TV, the same is true for fiction. If you think of Game of Thrones, the popular TV show, the books are generally considered very good. They're very they're quite long, but they're very good. I have not, in fact, read them, but they're generally considered to be very good. But the TV show, although good in its earlier days, went downhill in the sort of later series because they strayed away from the books. And I think this is because this lacks the truth of the story, okay? And that's what we really want. TV producers, however, are sort of clearly angling for less meaningful content, such as the violence or the nudity or the graphics or something, to sell their show, but sort of miss that mark a little bit. And this is in part because TV is more restricted in production. They have to make money to pay for everyone that's helped to produce it, and only have a set amount of time to produce it. Authors, however, don't necessarily have these same types of constraints, so it can lead to the content being more authentic and considered. They're thinking more of the story than all of the bells and whistles. So again, another instance where TV has captured less of a story than a book. And again, you could deduce that books are generally better or more true than TV. And so, so then this is sort of, my goal is not to give you a long list of these sort of examples, but more showing you the sort of process that you can just spend thinking about things, whereby you can come to conclusions such as these, such as we should probably be reading more books and less Netflix. But so, yeah, why is this example so important? Well, it's important because much like how the contents of the books are more or less one person, the author's opinion, we have to understand how we can trust people, trust in someone and what they say, and how much and to what extent to do that. It might seem strange to link truth to another, individual, because how would they be any more truth-bound than yourself, right? Why should we just listen to someone over our own sort of compass? Well, it doesn't seem to rub us up the wrong way when we consider teachers, let alone university lecturers. And again, various factors have gone into allow someone to be capable of teaching. Okay, these days there are many levels people have to go through to get to this position. In terms of university lecturing, this means being having much peer assessed works, a PhD often, and then following that often vast experience in their field. And if you're still quite skeptical about, is this lecturer giving me the truthful information, of course you can hopefully check up on what they've said and see if it's being accurate. So this is similar to our first point, our little method at the beginning. You're building up your observations, okay, and then you're checking them, you're verifying them, much like we saw in that scientific kind of approach, and deducing that what they say happens to be true most of the time, and so we can trust them to tell us the truth, at least in their field. Now, this is a viewpoint that's quite traditionally held. I think teachers can teach us something. Thus, some reliance on tradition can help us to establish our truths. It's reasonable to do what others have done unless we have a very good reason not to. It's reasonable to become educated and work and find love and have a family. This is how culture maintains itself. Okay, and this is why it shouldn't surprise us as Catholics that the church is often founded on this idea of tradition. And I think this is partly why, because it's a good guide. But it is necessary when following these types of truths, however traditional, to have your eyes wide open. Okay, you have to have a way to attain truths. You might have a way to find truths, but it could be wrong. Okay, so you must therefore make friends with what you don't know instead of what you do know. You see this with people who read a lot. I seem to be an evangelist of reading, but but yes, you see this with people who read a lot. Often they're often more aware of how much they don't know, despite having read a great deal of information. I don't know if anyone else has found this, but I've gained that from my experience. And so you must remove the beam in your own eye before you can concern yourself with the mote in your brother's. And in this way, you strengthen your own spirit and rejuvenate the community. Okay. So on a more practical level, you can think of this. I like to look at John Henry Newman here. And he says that when we go out to meet the culture, we should do it in a way that an animal goes out to into its environment. Here I've chosen a monkey. I didn't really know which animal I was picturing, but I've chosen this one. And so that is to say, animal in its environment, that is to say that we should assimilate what we can from our environment and resist what we must, because as an animal, if you don't do both those things, you'll be dead in very short order. So this is going to highlight my lack of information about how monkeys live, but I'm going to try an example of that. So let's say a monkey is trying to build a sort of house, a base. I don't know what you call it. And it does it on the ground, but there's a large predator near. Well, then the monkey has to change its location of its base, its nest or whatever, into perhaps like a tree to avoid the predator. So it's assimilated what it can from the environment, right? It's used the trees around it and has used all of that, and the presence of the predator has taken all of that into account to therefore survive by building its base, its nest. What do monkeys live in? Elsewhere. Similarly, if it was not resisting its environment, if it was letting all the animals, all the other animals have all the food and wasn't really resisting or competing for the food, then again, it would also die. So it also has to resist certain elements of its environment to survive. And so as Christians, as Catholics, we should go out in this kind of canny style. The church has always done this. Look at Platonism, the Platonism of the church fathers. Look at the Logos theologies that are coming out of the dialogue with the philosophers at the time. Most famously, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. I think we saw in a later previous talk, he was dialoguing with these secular philosophies such as Averroes and that sort of thing. John Henry Newman in the 19th century, dialoguing with Locke and Hume. Okay, so they're assimilating what they can from their culture at the time. But at the same time, the church has to resist. If there's something in the culture that is inimical to its form of life, so damaging to its form of life, then it has to resist. And that's true. This is why we have martyrs from the very beginning. At every age, the great saints have resisted. Thomas More is a good example for those of you who don't know. He was a lawyer, a statesman, and Henry VIII's Chancellor of England. And he died because he wouldn't recognize Henry VIII as the head of the church, especially when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. And so if we look at Thomas More, he was someone who knew how to assimilate with the culture and move almost creatively with it. He rose to a very high point in his culture, right? The Lord Chancellor of England. But then he realized, no, he couldn't do what the king was asking him to do, to sort of compromise his belief for his annulment of his wife. And so he resisted to the point of death, making him a martyr. And so, there we're sort of speaking more generally about doing both. But what's the sign? What is inimical to both truth? Well, the sign is that what is inimical to both truth and love has to be resisted. Okay, so what's damaging to truth and love has to be resisted. And so if there's something in the culture that is moving you away from love and towards self-protection, isolation, separation, in the base sense, alienation from others, and what's leading you away from truth? I don't mean that in a sort of trivial way, but God is truth. Okay, we saw that earlier with the divine simplicity. That means God is most fully real. Okay, we saw truth is being in accordance with factoriality. So that if God is truth, that means God is most fully real. So therefore, what's false, what's unreal, what's not the case, that's always inimical to God and the things of God. And we sort of know, which is a sad truth, that in our cultures, all of other cultures, including our own, are predicated often on lies and distortions and half-truths and so on. I mean, if you don't believe me on that one, if you're quite hopeful, you can think of all of the fake news that we've seen, especially in the last sort of 10 years. We're sort of, predicated on these sort of distortions and half-truths. I mean, if you want some examples of half-truths, you just have to look at some more, what do they call them, tabloid type newspapers, where they take often a small truth, half-truth, and then they give it a sort of very baity title to get you to click on it. I think I saw the other day one about, was it a cardinal or something? I can't remember his name at this point. Someone I'm sure will know. But there was a cardinal, and the article title I saw was Pope fires African cardinal, and it was, and then later I read the article, and it turned out that this cardinal was 4 months away from his retirement, and so asked for a slight early retirement from the Pope, and the Pope accepted it. And so you can see how our culture is predicated on these half-truths and distortions of them. So the church and us, we have to resist them and call them out. So that's quite a broad sense of sort of how we deal with it. But let's bring it sort of maybe more more practical. So if we're dealing with friends, we have to keep these principles in mind. You're always that sort of foraging animal, that monkey, assimilating and resisting. You're sensitive to both truth and love all the time. Okay, it's that famous balancing act. And so does that mean that anytime you sense an untruth, you say it? Well, no, not necessarily, because that could end up violating the principle of love. If you're like, hey, you're wrong about that, let me tell you why. That's the internet. That's sort of, you're now, you're truthful, but you're violating this principle of love. If we turn it around, you can also love that violates the principle of truth. So you can be like, oh, I just love everybody. I don't make any judgments. I don't, say anything that's wrong. Well, that's not right either, because in this way, you're being loving, but you're now going against what is true. And so you're moving there in between truth and love, and you're making your way as that sort of canny animal. And so if we look at our sort of conclusive points here, this is sort of what we want to take away from this talk today, is that truth is, the first thing is to get rid of that misconception that some methods, some scientific methods are 100% true. Whereas again, we have to recognize that they're still based on probability and testing, right? Much as other truths are about behavior, psychology, same sort of thing. So truth is rarely as 100% as we think it ought to be. Use our ability to verify and build deduction. So again, as we saw with all of the books and other forms, we're using our rational mind to constantly sort of take in information and sort of check it, but then eventually trust in that sort of thing. Third, we've got to recognize that we could be warped away from the true, the good, and the beautiful. So that's an important takeaway, I think. That thing about the diet, how our tastes were, we didn't like the healthy food anymore. It wasn't even appealing to us. We tasted it and it didn't taste very nice, because our perception of what is good and true and beautiful has been warped. We know they're good for us, right? We've got, for so many people sort of saying they're good for us, but to us, it doesn't seem that way. And so we have to understand within ourselves what is true and what perhaps could have been warped. And then once we have that, we can sort of step out into our culture and assimilate what we can from it, but then resisting what we must, as we saw from some of those examples. So we're acting in a balance of truth and love. And lastly, what I'll say, having written this one down, but it's always good, I think, when evangelizing, when um, sort of trying to spread our faith, that we keep in mind those transcendentals. I know that was only a part of what we talked about today, but they are quite a powerful way, because God is truth. This idea of divine simplicity is all those things, and so not one of them is better than the other. And I think often when we talk to people about our faith, especially over the internet where there's less of that personal side, people can be very hard hitting with what is true and what is good. Okay. And as we've seen, it takes quite a lot to be able to trust in what we believe to be true. We sort of always have to be questioning, but also trusting in this way. And so you get a lot of people saying, you're wrong. Let me tell you why you're wrong. And it's quite sort of abrasive. Okay. What's worse is you often get people saying, that you're acting badly. I mean, that's the last thing people want to hear is what you're doing. That's wrong. And so that's also quite abrasive. People put their defenses up if you try to start telling them that sort of thing. Whereas this idea of beauty, which again is just as equal as the true and the good. Beauty is something quite winsome. It's not very, no one puts their defenses up if you're like, oh, just take a look at this landscape, or take a look at this painting, or listen to this piece of music. The defenses aren't up there because people don't often feel like they're in harm's way. And I believe that once you as long as you can get someone to, I guess, latch onto any of these, then the other two start to do their work. So I think once you've convinced someone of beauty, especially that more objective kind that we were talking about, then often the gears are already in motion. Often they'll then lean towards eventually the good and then the true. And so I think if you are hoping to spread your message, then I'd always say the beautiful is a good place to start. Think of a sort of it's my last example. I do like an example, but think of a sort of sporting match or a game, let's say football, because we're in England. Football, you don't necessarily show, if someone wants to play football, you don't show them the rule book, do you? You don't say, okay, here's the offside rule, here are all of these various rules. This is how you play the game. You take them to a match, and you get them to be part of the atmosphere. You get them to understand what it means to sort of play the game. And once they're convinced of that, then they'll learn the rules themselves because they want to experience more of what the game can offer. And that's the same with our faith. And so I think that's all I have to say. Hopefully I've tried. I didn't want to say too much, but I feel like probably have. Oh gosh, I have, yeah. Anyway, and so yes, thank you for listening. And I think, is that it? Yeah. Oh, there's some further reading for you if you want. I just thought these are my sort of references. I realized as I was preaching about it, I should probably include some of my own. These are just some good books that I've been reading, but I think I got some information from here. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, quick questions. Yeah.
Toby, I loved this whole talk. I thought it was really cool and very relevant. So one thing that I've heard about the transcendentals, and I was actually having a conversation about this just yesterday, was that sometimes one specific one kind of maybe draws you a bit more. Is that true? Do you know? And do you feel like yours? Are you able to pick it yourself, or what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's true. As I said, they're all sort of equal, and so although I said there's that sort of pathway through beauty, which is quite winsome, it's not very aggressive. I think you can latch onto any of them, and because they're all sort of equal in that way, you'll come to know the others just by the process. I think for me, I don't know. It's a sort of tough one actually. I think for me they're all quite. I think I've always been drawn to quite all three of them. I find I've always thought I've had quite a good sense of truth, as to sort of when it comes, and I've sort of had I feel like I've got a good notion of what is true, and often I then check to see if it is, and often I can be right sometimes. So I'm I've always thought that was, especially with people. I don't know. I feel like I'm a good judge of character. I'm not, I'm not going to hedge a bet on that. But then again, I'm a musician, and so I've always been drawn to beauty in music. Um, yeah, I like classical music quite a lot, and so I've always been drawn to this sort of very ethereal quality of music. And then lastly, I love a good superhero film, which is often to do with good moral action. I think one of my favorite ones is Captain America, which is a bit controversial because often I don't think that's a very good one apparently in relation to the others, but I just don't think I like him because he's very moral. So I don't know. I guess all three are quite appealing to me.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Thank you. What about you? Oh, you said truth, didn't you?
No, I mean, I love this talk, but I feel I need to think more about all three. But for me, I think I'm so drawn to things that are good. The transcendental of goodness, I think really